My name is Theodor Sandal Rolfsen, recent PhD in theology, and with me I have a wonderful cast who are going to discuss today the meaning of life. So I give the mic to you, Espen.
My name is Espen Dahl. I'm a professor in theology at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, and I work mainly with philosophy of religion.
Hi, I'm Carl O'Brien, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Ancient Classics at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth, and I specialise in ancient philosophy, particularly Platonism.
And I'm Istvan Czachesz, and I also teach at the Arctic University of Norway with Espen. And I teach here mainly biblical studies and also work on different other things, the intersection of science and religion, for example.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Very excited to have you all together here. And today's topic is, as we said, the meaning of life, which is a grand topic, a topic that we recently had a seminar on and which got us into the idea of having this podcast. So that is the theme we thought we would start out with. So what is the meaning of life? There is no other question that can be both so profound and so cliché at the same time. Some take this question to be the most important question humans can ask themselves, and often take it as a distinguishing factor between human and animal life. Humans do not simply live and die, but we ask ourselves why we do it. Others find the question paradoxically completely meaningless, as if there could be or needs to be a why to existence. Whatever the case may be, is it possible to get a better understanding of what we're asking about when we're asking about the meaning of life? Why are humans occupied and sometimes obsessed with this question? And what difference does it make whether it is a meaningful question or not? How have people answered it historically, and how do people answer it today? In this podcast episode, we will approach the question of the meaning of life, not only in order to find out whether there is such a meaning, but also to gain a greater clarity what it is that we're asking about in the first place. So, gentlemen, that is the first question that I wanted to ask you. What are we really asking about when we're asking about the meaning of life?
Well, first of all, the fact that it is a question is in itself interesting because, in order to raise such a question, you simply have to presuppose life. That's one thing. And another thing is that you have to have some kind of ability to reflect on life. And then we might think that this is not only something that distinguishes humans from other animals, but perhaps one of the essential part of what it means to be human, namely to be able to ask this kind of general philosophical questions about its most general conditions as a human being. So that's one. Yeah.
So it's a sort of like it's interesting that it's a question in general, that there is a question to begin with, that in itself is sort of like a curious fact.
Yes, and as you pointed to in your introduction, which is really fascinating, I think, is that one seems to be extremely profound. But on the other hand, it's almost a cliché. It's as if it seems to us to be superficial. So what kind of question is the question of meaning of life? Is it profound, or is it superficial, or is it exactly profound because it seems to be superficial? I mean, it's in one sense, at least we could say it's an archetypical philosophical question because it's so general that it tends to become almost a triviality. And on the other hand, precisely because it is so general and tend to be trivial, it can also open for this, we don't really have an answer to it. So it has this kind of profundity to it, or there is no, or so it seems, it opens up as a wonder, because perhaps there is no prefabricated answers. That's the complexity and perplexity of it, that we don't have a ready-made answer for what the question itself is.
I think that's important, because we could all agree that it's important that there should be a meaning of life, and we could talk, for example, about things like, well, we could all agree that happiness is an ultimate aim, but then we'd all probably start disagreeing, saying, well, what does this happiness actually consist of?
Don't people spontaneously ask, so, or at least reflect on their lives, saying, oh, my life has no meaning, or I want my life to have a meaning, something like that? Is it, or is it not as universal as I imagine?
Does it not presuppose a certain level of privilege to be in the situation where you say, does my life have meaning? Because that presupposes that all your lower needs are being met, right? That you have everything that you need for survival. You have shelter, you have food, and then you can reflect on these things. So I'm sure there are lots of people that never really worried about life having meaning while they were just focusing on survival.
Yeah, because I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned this one, like, to what sense do all people spontaneously reflect on, does my life have a meaning? If it doesn't, how do I get it? Like, does people spontaneously desire that in the same way, for example, that all people desire foods? Is the question of meaning of life a sort of a universal feature of the human condition, or is it for people who have, as you mentioned, Carl, their basic necessities met?
It's an interesting question, and I guess, Carl, you know more about this than I do, but certainly I come to think about the polis, the Greek city-state where philosophy historically originated, at least in the sense that we know it in the Western tradition, and that was a state where you had the luxury of free men that could actually have both the time and all their basic needs, probably already prepared for, so that they could spend time in reflection.
I think that's an important point, because it also presupposes that there are other people who take care of basic needs and don't have access, right? So, I mean, if you think of like Aristotle's idea, you really need women to run the household so that the male citizen is free to engage in public life, or in Plato, where you have this idea of a philosopher king, but the lower two strata of society are the ones that make this kind of freedom possible.
But let's say that we wanted to sort of like scientifically classify what meaning is. Sort of what would be what is the difference between a meaningful life and a meaningless life?
Okay, my hunch is that the question of meaningfulness is not exactly the same as meaning. So I mean, when we ask in what sort of condition people have to be able to ask about the meaning of life, we of course already restricted this to human beings, and obviously language seems to be, at least symbolic language seems to be pretty much a human phenomenon. Whatever we find out, of course, about other animals, which is still an open question, but we can really say that, of course, it's humans who write books about philosophy. That being said, I mean, I read a bit on the question of meaning in biology. And there's a long tradition of people saying that different biological organisms are meaning makers. And it can go, some would argue that all the way down to a cell. It's about the interpretation of their environment, of their interactions, and so on. I mean, certainly there needs to be some difference, and there is, but the that understanding of meaning, I just at least want to, bring this into our discussion, expands it way beyond the scope of, let's say, aristocratic philosophy in ancient Athens. I don't think that simple organisms would much think about the meaning of life. But then the question is, when is it when it appears? Can it be somewhat pre-linguistic to have some kind of understanding of meaning, and was one kind of understanding of one's position in a group, for example, and seeing one's life as, determined by being the alpha male in the group, or being a beta male in the group, or whatever. So it's not that self-evident that it's a kind of on-off discontinuous thing. I think that at least arguments can be made, for the case can be made for a more gradual understanding. And then, I leave it there. I can come back to some of it later.
It's a very, very interesting perspective, and of course, to think about life, then we expand it to all kinds of organism, all kinds of animal life, at least, and perhaps beyond that, even to plants and basic cellular organisms. But so instead of just thinking about them as quasi-mechanical or chemical reactions or whatever, in a very complex way, that then you bring in something else when you begin to speak about meaning, namely that they have some kind of, I don't know what exactly this meaning would be in the biological sense, but somehow it seems to have something to do with organization, integration, purpose, things like that, and seeing it or relating in specific ways to its environment and so forth. But I think perhaps we need to, to make a distinction, because we started to speak about raising the question about meaning of life, and that is one thing, and that's a reflective, a reflective thought, a thought that turns back on itself. So that's, of course, then you need to have we have mentioned the polis. You need some some resources, you need the time, probably also someone to speak to, and so on, to reflect with. But of course, that doesn't mean that, let's say, the women in the household in the old ancient world did not necessarily have a meaningful life, because one thing is to be able to discuss what meaning is, and another thing is the meaning itself. And that seems to be presupposed even in the philosophical discussion. It doesn't invent what the meaning of life is. What it attempts to do is to reflect back, interrogate what is already there, and see if it could find it, and draw some conclusions or consequences from it, or what.
I think that's like to sort of discuss what meaning is, on the one hand, how it can be sort of exist in the background for some people, and how that background sort of becomes visible when the meaning of life becomes questioned. because I think that if you take like modern nihilism as an example, right, like people despairing that there is no meaning to life, they would look back at, let's say, someone who was a peasant under some king in some previous epoch and say that they lived a meaningful life, or they believed that life had meaning because they understood themselves as part of, for example, a divine plan that was everything was coming from somewhere and everything was moving somewhere. And if you did the good stuff, then you would be going in the good direction. And if you did the bad stuff, then you'd be going in the bad direction. So people who despair that life is meaningless would probably say that someone who lived that sort of life, where they believed that life had a purpose and a direction and a final destination, that they were living, that they believed that life had a meaning, right? So it seems that that it isn't necessarily the fact that you have to critically reflect on the meaning of life in order to live a life that you somehow believe is meaningful, if you exist in some sort of like cosmos that is meaningful. But when we start, especially when we start questioning whether there is a meaning to life, that sort of like structure appears. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think if you pick up, Theodor, with your structure, if you look at, say, something like the Iliad, where you have this structure of a heroic code, you know, where you die in battle and you win glory, and being able to amass material possessions is seen as a kind of value. And there is this sense that maybe that isn't meaningful. So that there is, or you do have this kind of element of questioning entering that in various ways. Where, for example, Achilles presents his choice of, you know, I could go to Troy, or I could stay at Troy and die here, or I could go back home and have a good life. And actually, maybe it's not worth it. Or this idea that you do have a structure where, like when Sarpedon is speaking to Glaucus, he says, you know, we get the most privileges from our people, so we have to fight on the front line and win glory. But then he says, if we could choose, if we could live forever, then I would be the first to say, let's withdraw from the fighting. But since we're going to die anyway, let's either win glory for ourselves or be prepared to yield it to others. So it's very much this idea that mortals have to die sometime, but what they really should get is glory, amass material possessions, and have a magnificent funeral. And I mean, I think if you look at the Odyssey, that's challenged, where Odysseus goes into the underworld and he questions Achilles and says, you know, you're glorious. And Achilles says, I'd rather be the slave of the poorest man on earth than to be king of all the dead men.
All right. Yeah, I would still stick to this idea of meaningfulness versus meaning. Meaningfulness, yeah, I just, you know, following up on what Carl said, I can clearly see this as a maybe one-dimensional thing. It's either or little meaning, more meaning. My life has little meaning, has more meaning. It's a little meaningful. It's very meaningful. Maybe you can do it on a definite number of dimensions as well. So it's meaningful in some sense, it's not meaningful in some other sense. But still, it seems to me kind of, I'm not saying it's simple to decide, but intuitively, this is a kind of, you know, the cup is full, the cup is half full, half empty. There's a little bit in the cup, so it's a kind of, you know, quantifiable phenomenon. I mean, meaning seems to be a much fuzzier thing. So and then of course we are, you know, touching upon this, you know, concept whether meaning in other domains, how much can we import that into the discussion of meaning of life? And obviously I argue for it, but so to me, asking what the meaning of life is really a much more, you know, complex idea. So exactly, you can have I mean, slaves can have in antiquity stories about that. They would tell about themselves and their lives. And it's certainly about the meaning of their lives. So they are making meanings. They are coming up with meanings as they emphasize things or de-emphasize things, as they contextualize their lives, as they see themselves as part of a household, part of a class, and so on and so forth. So I just want to open it up. I get a bit nervous, just referring back a little bit to our meeting a couple of months ago, when it came too much to this, quantifying of, quantification of the meaningfulness of life, which actually I can understand if meaningfulness is defined in those terms. Sure, you can have little, more, and much, and a lot. But when I put in meaning, then I can see a much more, complex and dynamical thing there.
Just because just to be sure that I understand what you mean, when you distinguish between meaning and meaningfulness, the question of meaningfulness is the sort of question, did my life have a purpose? Did I fill my life with meaningful activities in contrast to meaningless ones? Did I attain the glory that you spoke of, Clark, or did I simply live basely? But when you say, and that's meaningfulness, but when you say meaning, then you mean sort of like intelligibility, the possibility of communication, the idea that for example, at some level, if it would be a cellular level or a more complex forms of organisms, that an organism can have sort of like an idea that is transmitted, or like a symbolic, live in some sort of symbolic universe. Is that the difference you're making?
Yes, maybe yes, but I would also leave it open to other agents to talk about the meaning of my life. And I wanted to put in this phenomenon of biography, which emerges also in ancient Athens. And I don't know if it's still the recent opinion, but 2 decades ago, when I did a little study of that for my dissertation, there was still a kind of sense that Plato's Apology of Socrates is the kind of archetype. This is the first, proper biography. Maybe it is not, but the point is that so just beyond saying that, well, a biography should be written about kings or generals, it starts to open up. So life, you can look at someone else's life and write it up as a story, and then you elaborate on its meaning. And so I mean, I could write a biography of a cell in my body, maybe, if I were a good enough scholar and had all the instruments to do that. And that could be a biography, and that could attribute meanings, and I can attribute meanings to my life as well. So it kind of becomes more of this hermeneutical process rather than just quantification of less or more meaning. And obviously, if I would say, if I can find meanings in my life or someone else's life, obviously you can say it's a meaningful life. So in this sense, probably there is no meaningless life at all, or a life without meaningfulness at all, because for sure someone else at least can come up with ideas about the meaning of your life or someone else's life.
But so no, go ahead, Espen, if you had something.
No, I just I mean, I think that's sounds like a fruitful way to approach meaning of life. I mean, let's say the biography. Okay, we could discuss, of course, if that is a attribution or more of a transcription, but certainly it does presuppose that there has been some kind of life which has a certain temporal structure. It has a story to be told. It started one place, ended another, and so on and so forth. And of course, that's the kind of, our past and our future is certainly very much a part of what makes our identity. and certainly also what makes, and in that sense, you know, that there is always, as you said, there is always meaning to a life, because there is always, however miserable, there is a story that could be told about it. So there seems to me that there is this, you know, on a, let's say, pre-philosophical level, whatever life, whatever you brought up the question of the meaning of life or not, there is, we take for granted that there is some kind of coherence, meaningfulness. It could be, you could spell it out in terms of, you know, this kind of narrative identity. There are also other things. I mean, the fact that we ask ourselves who we are, how we came here, and what purpose life has. We are already thrown into the midst of a life already, and yes, it somehow it is always it's already intelligible to us, but that doesn't mean that you can't ask these radical reflective questions. What is it that makes it meaningful? Because even if there is some kind of meaning, it's not clear. It's not clearly the case that we know exactly what it is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking together, I guess. And also, you know, I mean, one of the important strands of modern philosophy, existentialism, not very popular these days, but what they did from Kierkegaard onwards was to bring back this kind of life questions back into philosophy. I guess they were very much alive in the antiquity, but then they came back with perhaps an individual twist. But I think one of the things that's a common topic there is that, you know, to ask the radical questions of your life also means that you also must ask yourself whether you live according to your own or some divine order or an ethical standard. You know, even if there is this first level of intelligibility, that we have some kind of, all of us say have some kind of story to tell, doesn't mean that it's a good story. And it could mean that we should change because it doesn't really fit into this more radical question of, you know, the highest values of life, the goals of life, that kind of questions. But I'm not quite sure how to distinguish between that. It seems to me that there must be two levels: the pre-philosophical lived life where we have meaning of life, and the other radical questioning, what is this meaning of life? And they are, of course, somehow related, but exactly how to distinguish and correlate them, I'm not so sure.
I mean, to pick up with your point, Espen, I think you're right in that there are the two levels. And when you look at, you know, early, if we can call them biographies or early narratives, where you look at someone's life and say as Istvan mentioned, the Apology of Socrates or Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, where you have a narrative about someone, the value often comes not simply from the construct of the narrative, right? But it comes from this kind of ethical framework, or if you like, some sort of life of service, according to which the life is led. And it's that gives the narrative some sort of meaning, not the narrative alone. Or maybe to come back to Istvan's point, the narrative gives it meaning because you have a story to tell, but the ethical framework in which the life is lived, in which the narrative is told, is what gives it the meaningfulness.
Okay.
Isn't there also a trend in the New Testament scholarship to regard, you know, the Gospels as in terms of ancient antique biographies?
Oh yes, very much so.
And would that fit into what Carl is saying about, you know, portraying one in? Yeah.
Yes, very much so. And I wanted to comment on that at some point. So one way to speak about biography in the biblical studies, yes, it's certainly an important issue in the study of the Gospels. But other than that, one of the ideas is that there existed a so-called ideal biography in at least the ancient Near East, which was pretty much an elite kind of idea. So an ideal biography would be told about a king, about a prophet, and it would be related to some kind of divine call and some kind of task that in the service of the god that individual has to complete. And it's quite obvious that that kind of life was seen as meaningful. It received its meaning from this call to service. And then also the Gospels can be put into that sort of framework, right? And they start with this divine call. I'm not talking theology now. I'm just within the narrative, there is this kind of call which you can identify with the baptism of Jesus, and some other moments which can be seen as calls, commissions to perform a task. And very importantly, it ends with martyrdom. And so martyrdom was another decisive element. And of course, you see it already in Socrates. The Apology emphasizes this very much. Not everybody was martyred, but there was a long tradition of important heroes who ended as martyrs. It became an ideal in the Jewish freedom fights against the Greek domination, for example, in the 3rd century. So that kind of tradition certainly went into the Gospels as well. And then eventually into the lives of the saints and the martyrs. And so, yes, within that kind of tradition, certainly the lives of Jesus, as we could call those biographies or the gospel narratives, can be understood, certainly. And it's a separate issue whether the literary level, qualifies as a classical kind of biography. People compared it with Plutarch and others, and try to say, okay, this is not quite a biography. But I think for us that is not really important, right? It's not the level of Greek or the literary composition that really matters. What matters is that the Gospels certainly reach back to some of those important elements that define biographies.
A follow-up question to that, I guess, in the context of the gospel specifically, maybe one difference would be that generally, like, meaningful biographies tend to be about a person and their calling and like their attempts to fulfill that calling, whereas the gospels are, Jesus calling us, like Jesus is calling on people. So we're not following Jesus living up to his calling, but we're following Jesus calling to people. Is that a relevant difference?
Yes, it might be, but then the answer would be that this is a particular type of biography, which is about the leader of a philosophical school. And then you have those stories, countless stories in the biographies of the philosophers that would tell you about how Socrates called Xenophon and so on. So this idea of a call, or even kind of divine call, and then within the story, the philosopher then calls disciples. I mean, discipleship is obviously a major thing. Maybe Karl can tell us more about that. But I think it is a very important motive in how you think about philosophy and philosophers in that time. So around the turn of the era.
That is very true. But I want to snag, because I actually want to ask Karl another question that I also thought of, because in the sense you mentioned martyrdom, and that's also very interesting when we talk about the meaning of life, that we mentioned earlier this sort of, that it often seems that you need your basic needs met, and then you can start speaking about the meaning of life. But also it often seems that it's also that for someone who has their basic needs, that when they are willing to sacrifice that material safety and even risk their own lives, that's when you're doing something meaningful. That's what, you know, goes beyond sort of like banal, animalistic, you know, eat, sex, survive, and it becomes something more. And that made me think of the opening to the Republic, where this is the question between Glaucon and Socrates, if I remember correctly. You know, whether the good man is also the happy man. You know, is it valuable and is it meaningful to care about more than your animalistic basic needs, and also, you know, live a life of service in virtue of something that's higher than yourself? Or is that not meaningful and you should just, you know, grab as much stuff as you can, basically?
Well, yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, Plato in the Apology, you know, he has Socrates say nothing bad can happen to a good man, either in life or after death, and the gods don't forget him. And I mean, you do have this very much this kind of construct with Socrates, where he is faced with the possibility of saving his own life, and he says, you know, I could suggest that a fine as the counter alternative to the death sentence, to the death penalty. And he says, well, you know, even if I escape from this death sentence, I'm not going to change. I'm going to go around and ask people questions, and I'm going to annoy people. And I could be kicked out of Athens, but then I'll just go around and question the people wherever I end up. And if the Athenians, who are my fellow citizens, won't tolerate me being the sort of man that I am, well, why would foreigners, if you like, why would they tolerate me? So life has to be lived on his terms, right? And you have it with Epictetus in the discourses, where he talks about people making choices. For example, an athlete who has a choice between an operation and dying, and he chooses to die. And Epictetus says, well, you know, if I had to choose between my beard and death, then I choose my beard. Because it's really, you know, this idea that you're entitled to choose to live life on your own terms. I mean, the Stoics sometimes do criticize that, you know, where they say, you know, wait for God. But there is this kind of feeling that a certain type of life is meaningful, and if some external agent or force comes in and tries to take that type of life away from you, then it is meaningful to choose death rather than simply living on with that taken away.
One thing, I just had this association because of I imagine, without knowing too much about it, that in antiquity, in the sources that you are talking about, for instance, in Plato, of course, there are choices. You know, people have choices. Should I follow this path or that one? And some might be trivial, some might be, you know, matter of life and death, as in Socrates' example. But then the standards that gives, you know, it makes it meaningful to let's say choose death or sacrifice, does not, it seems to me, or let me formulate it as a question: does it come from the individual, or is this a kind of set, you know, that there is some kind of commonly goods that you can appeal to, a kind of relatively stable framework? Of course, we choose differently, but the framework itself is rather stable. So that's one question. And in contrast, I would think when you come to the, let's say, the 20th century, or let's say after Nietzsche, then things, you still have, of course, this coming back to existentialism again, this accentuation of on the choice. I mean, if you look at Heidegger, Sartre, Tillich, Bultmann, all of these would say that, you know, really the pivotal moment in life are those where you experience your freedom and make choices. But then it seems, perhaps not so much for the theologians as Bultmann and Tillich, but especially for Sartre, I would guess that it's absolutely not a matter of choosing within a stable framework that are commonly held as, you know, simply their commonly background or something like that. But what makes the decision of meaningful or fulfilling your meaning of life is exactly to choose. So you don't have any longer anything else to go on than your own individuality. Of course, lots of people has you know, protested to that kind of view, but it is a little bit, you know, there is a dramatic change from, you know, choosing within a stable framework and then to be the one who choose the very you know, what is the values to be pursued at all. But I don't know, what do you think, Carl, in back in the days where the matter of, for instance, for Socrates, was it just a matter of his personal integrity, or did it respond to, you know, some kind of more stable framework of values and religious opinions and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this element of religious opinion that was right, because in the Apology, he presents himself as having this divinely entrusted framework, right, where Chaerephon goes to the oracle and asks the god of Delphi, who's the wisest person, and they say Socrates, and so this starts his kind of questioning. So there does seem to be, or at least in his presentation of his life, there is a divinely imposed task. And you definitely see this kind of indicated if you look at other frameworks where you have this kind of meaning of life in a narrative biography or fictionalized account. You know, if you think of Aelius Aristides in the Sacred Tales, where he has this kind of life of service to a god, or in Apuleius in the Metamorphosis, there is this imposition of a a kind of turn towards religion. But I mean, I think many of these texts actually do undercut it themselves, right? So in the Metamorphosis, you have this inset narrative of the love affair between Psyche and Cupid. And obviously you can read that as the desire of the mortal soul for God. But the product of their union is voluptas. The product of their union is pleasure. It's not anything kind of meaningful. And so you have a lot of these narratives. You go back right to the Iliad in terms of something idiosyncratic. I mean, you have this scene where in Book 9 of the Iliad, Achilles rejects the Homeric or the heroic code. So the code by which his class live. And he says, no, I don't want a part of this. I just want to go in retirement. I have, you know, my dad has enough wealth. I don't need to get more booty, and I'll just marry a local girl. I don't need this concubine that I captured. And it's so a complete rejection of the heroic code. But the point is, he doesn't really reject it because he's come to the point that it's meaningless. He rejects it because he thinks that he, as a superior person, will always be locked as the inferior of a petty, useless man like Agamemnon. And that's really why he rejects it. And I think so you do have in these texts very much a freedom to have this kind of expression of a very idiosyncratic framework, even if, you know, we can find a pattern across a lot of the texts.
Okay.
So that's an interesting question, because Espen, you mentioned on this sort of 20th century Nietzsche, you know, post-metaphysical, the death of God sort of universe that some would say that we exist in, that there's a sort of like radical break where the sort of idea of a metaphysical stable order falls away. And then you have, Carl, you mentioned these idiosyncrasies that existed already in Homer's works, where, you know, sometimes people are willing to throw away that sort of metaphysical system of, for example, the hero cult, and be like, no, I just want to have voluptas. I just want pleasure. I just want, and so that's an interesting question. Have we gone from a metaphysical world where the life has meaning to a post-metaphysical world where it doesn't have meaning? Or did this conflict exist in all historical epochs, where you have this idea that there is a metaphysical framework, and then some people sort of see through it and are like, no, I don't want to play by these made-up rules. I just want the booty, basically.
Well, sorry, Istvan, go ahead.
I would like to drag down the discussion actually from this elevated level and say I absolutely believe that there is at least a fairly universal understanding and has been unchallenged mostly. And when it was challenged, it was for good reasons. And the basic understanding of meaning of life is exactly to have a family and to have offspring. and it should be so, because we wouldn't be here if this hadn't been a basic shared understanding of humankind. And you see this in the Psalms, in Psalm 128. So the man who loves God is blessed and happy because he has a wife and he has the children and he has a house, and this kind of idyllic kind of life with a family. Having your fig tree is another symbol. Having olives and fig and grapes and so this kind of images in the Hebrew Bible for sure tell you that people are longing for this. And I do believe that this becomes very meaningful if you don't have it, especially when it is war, and there's been plenty of that in the history of the Jewish people already in antiquity. So maybe this, quite interestingly, this comes to the foreground when you don't have it. And of course there is the kind of nihilistic option. So Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, right? There is all this negativity about nothing really has a value, and nothing makes sense, and life is just meaningless. And so, but I think that's already the philosopher talking, so yeah.
So you would distinguish sharply between the kind of let's keep it within the framework of Old Testament and of the wisdom literature that rises the philosophical voice, and then the other parts of the mainstream, so to say, where you find in Psalms and so on, where there is this, let's call it the simple life, blessed life with family and offsprings. And is that how you think about it? That there is some kind of a break here that's at a certain point there is this philosophical questions that somehow disturbs it, or what is the relation between the Ecclesiastes and the Psalms you were talking about?
Yeah, I think my argument would be there is this basic fabric of life that people would normally take for granted or desire if it's not there, and there is this problematization of it. Also in the book of Job, your expertise there, why is this man not? Why has the family and comfort and home being taken away from him? So yeah, which presupposes that this is what should happen to the righteous people, is that they do have all those things, because I would not say that this is completely unchallenged, but I think that we can understand many of those exceptions if we take this for granted in a way in the background. And I think people would look at Socrates and wonder, is this man really crazy? Just not longing for that kind of life. Same about Jesus, most definitely, and Jesus verbalizes this, saying that you have to give it up, and you have to throw away everything, and that's why it is such a big deal, because people would normally presuppose that it's the way, that's how my life has meaning, and it goes on and on, of course, from there. And Paul and others, I mean, the lives of the apostles generally, as they got. It's not in the New Testament, but you have those writings that are about the lives of Peter and Paul and the others, and they all present them as kind of itinerants and actually oftentimes very explicitly denying the value of those simple pleasures and the simple meanings that people would find in their life, and this entire ascetic movements there, the denial of those basic things. Anyhow, this goes on and on. I don't want to continue, but it seems that all of that presupposes a fairly shared understanding that it's some basic way to have meaning in your life.
There is, I come to think about this. There's a saying. I'm not quite sure who said this first, but it's quoted. It goes something like, "A happy life is without why," something like that. And and if you think in those terms, if you have the family you are talking about, if you are happily married and life is generally working okay, then why should you bother with the question of the meaning of life? And it struck me also then when you talked about this basic, this what seems to be in the Old Testament, perhaps the presupposed framework within life is fulfilled, namely in family life. It does also throw an interesting light on Job. Of course, he's most famous for all the trials he had to go through, and then all his protests and so on. But it remains a fact that he starts out with, not only a wealthy man, but with several children, and of course it mirrors exactly the same ideal, and things seems to be going very well. He's even very pious, and there is this reciprocity. God is generous to him, blesses him, and he is pious. And also after this long story about, let's say, the problem of evil in some sense, then it also returns in the same way. It goes back to normal. That someone thinks that's the most crazy part of it, that suddenly he gets his children back, or perhaps new children, but everything is restored. That's the happy ending here. But of whatever that means, I mean, that can be discussed at length. It does seem to affirm the thing that you are saying, Istvan, namely that this is where the good life resides, in this kind of family life. But then, of course, this life is without why, but the why rises exactly when this life breaks down. That's where philosophy or wisdom, or whatever you want to call it, that's where the reflection about the radical reflection of life, whether within a religious framework as in Job, or whatever in Nietzsche or whatever, it seems to start first from the point where start to suffer, or something is lost, or you are away from the good life, and for no reasons, and for no so the question is, or the question, what I'm trying to get at is that the question of the meaning of life, I mean, the meaning of life might be, let's go with a Old Testament depiction of the happy family with many offsprings and livestock and all that. So that might have its own integrity, but we don't start to ask about it before something goes wrong. And that's where the question of meaning of life comes into the picture, as I see it.
Then I guess also an interesting follow-up question to that is sort of, if we have this sort of layer, we have the basic formula of life, which is sort of like what we're biologically predisposed to, copulate, multiply, as many as stars in heaven, all that stuff. You have the basic formula. And then you have those goddamn darn philosophers who have to start questioning it. But why? Why are you doing that? And I think that it's interesting that we've brought, I think we could bring Paul into the mix as well. there is this, I don't remember exactly where it is, but there's Paul is writing a letter responding to some questions, one of them being, is it better to be unmarried or to be married? And Paul goes into this thing where he's like, if you are married, just stay married. And if you're not married, maybe it's better to stay unmarried. But the important thing here is that you shouldn't divert your attention from the second coming, basically. And family life is something that he sees as potentially, this grabs it as such, he sees it as people who are sort of mixed into these daily routines, ordinary life cycles, where can I get some milk? Do I need to paint my wall? All these sort of like ordinary everyday questions, they might have their attention diverted away from what really matters. And it's interesting that someone like Nietzsche sort of fits into that category in another sense, because he's also like, oh yeah, get lost in that ordinary daily everyday bullshit, like finding a wife, finding work, having kids, blah blah blah, and then you miss out on what's really at stake in life, and that's making the right decision, taking charge of your destiny or something. So there seems to be sort of like interesting conflict between the sort of standard formula of life with its own integrity and the sort of like, no, you have to break with it. You have to depart from this sort of like what everybody does. Was das man, as Heidegger would say, that to find the meaning of life is precisely to not do what society expects of you or what nature expects from you. Is that correct to say that that's sort of like a recurring conflict, we could say?
It seems to be historically pretty much related, at least to me, to the history of the Jewish people in antiquity. So, and of course, I cannot talk about all the different visions that different cultures had, but at least if you compare this with Greece, where the hero has everything is kind of the idea, and in the Jewish history, the hero is the one who has nothing. It's the prophetic, lonely guy who's really kind of an outcast, and I think it's built on historical experience, even though there are some kind of probably partly embellished epochs in Jewish history where it's all nice and glorious, and David and Solomon and such. Mostly it is really tragic, and it's always connected, of course, to God's judgment, or at least when all those stories are finalized sometime, let's say in the 5th century or even later, they are understood. And this is meaning making, right? All those negatives, all those wars, lost wars and battles and occupations and so on, are attributed to somehow a breach of God's love and calling and contractual relationship with the people. So it is from this kind of tragic history, I would say, that probably this very different view of an exceptional life arises, and that exceptional life is then an exceptionally, in some way, bad life. when you lose and give up a lot. And I don't know if it's a straight line, but of course there are those movements like the Qumran settlement. So this is a Dead Sea area in Palestine, the land of Israel. That this community gathers. We don't know the exact story, but we have a lot of their writings. And it seems that they live by a lot of ascetic ideals, and they are giving up a lot of what we would think about as normal life. And it was mixed gender. There were even children there, so it's not a male group like the later monastic communities in a monastery. But they already set that kind of standard. And then, of course, later on, as you pointed out, Paul and the apostles have this kind of ideal, and the desert fathers who go out into the desert and leave behind civilization and they are fighting their demons there. You know, that's also interesting that you would say, okay, now they are alone, so at least they are not, you know, bothered, but they are bothered. I mean, if you want to psychologize it, they are bothered by their own, you know, impulses and their own, you know, conscience and their own perceived ungodliness and so on and on. So you have this continuation of this hero who is a kind of anti-cultural hero, or, you know, counter-cultural hero would be a better term. And, you know, Jesus is depicted as one of them, obviously.
This, I feel like, takes us into an interesting question, which I'm trying to find out exactly how to phrase it, but basically, is happiness the ultimate meaning of life, or is there some sort of special sort of meaning that's revealed in suffering? In general, how do we relate this question of meaning and in life, and to the question on the one hand of happiness, and to the other hand with suffering? Because it seems that a meaningful life could sometimes be seen as, you know, attaining the happy life, family, wealth, a healthy stock, or it could be that the ones who suffer are the ones who truly experience the meaning of life. So what do you think about this dichotomy of pain and pleasure when it comes to meaning?
Well, it's a huge question, of course, but because and it's a good question because we have now talked about, you know, when we're talking about all these things that we might take for granted as part of the meaningful life prior to reflection upon it, then we think about a well-functioning, happy life. And of course, I guess all the way back to that was probably an extremely strong tendency from the first Greek philosophers, I guess. Carl, you must comment on this, but you know, even and also became part of the Christian culture. For instance, surprisingly, to me at first, I discovered that, for instance, Augustine, that we think of as this, you know, thinking about his sin, all the problems with sexuality, and, you know, but he has this lengthy discussion about happy life. He doesn't question that that's important. Indeed, that seems to be taken for granted that what we pursue. But what he criticizes is the tendency to find it in, well, temporal things, because just as Plato would say, they understand that they will vanish. So it's no use to invest too much in them. But of course, to him, there is only one ultimate good, and that's God, you know, the only one that should be enjoyed for itself. But anyway, it seems that for him, the entire framework, I mean, he doesn't speak about meaningful life, but I guess it converges with this happy life. And on the other hand, you know, at the heart of the Christian tradition, you have pain and suffering. You know, it has played different roles throughout the history, from mystics that actually, you know, invokes pain experience to those who see that as belonging solely to the event on the cross and so on, and does only have meaning there. But for the most part, I will say that I guess that within this Christian, probably also Jewish tradition and beyond, there will be, you know, a kind of a possible connection between suffering and meaningfulness. But I think it's, you know, it's a big what place does suffering have in the meaningful life? Because of course, suffering as such, I would say, enormous physical pain or enormous depression, or going through, you know, war or enormous losses, whatever, it can ruin the sense of meaning of life, I would say. So it's not, I find it hard to see that suffering should be the royal road, so to speak, to the to meaningful life. But on the other hand, you know, there's no doubt that sacrifice might give extraordinary meaning to life. But then the suffering must be for something higher or for someone else, something like that. It must have a kind of ethical meaning that goes beyond the suffering itself. And yeah, so that would be my suggestion.
No, I'd have to agree with Istvan. Yeah, I think that's with Espen. With suffering can't be, you know, just a goal in itself, right? And I mean, if you look at a lot of philosophers, they wouldn't say that suffering is the highest goal in life or a higher moral state. It's philosophical contemplation that's really the happy life. And lots of philosophers do praise the happy life, and it is a kind of ultimate aim that they wouldn't see would require any justification. But like Augustine, a lot of philosophers would say, well, you know, this idea of finding happiness in temporal things or in sensuality or in material gain, that doesn't lead to a meaningful life. But if you are in a situation like Socrates, where you have to compromise your morals, or you can choose suffering, then obviously it's most important to protect your moral integrity, because you have to realize that you shouldn't even identify with your physical body, right? You have to identify with your true self, right? And I think that's really very powerfully conveyed when you talk about a figure like Boethius, who was imprisoned for political reasons, and you have this description of him as a prisoner in his cell, basically relearning philosophy and realizing, because he's particularly traumatized by the fact that his life was so good before. I mean, he was politically powerful. He was from one of the wealthiest families. He was successful and productive as a writer. So he basically had everything, and he loses it. And I think the beauty of that is having it's the kind of hierarchy where you have the figure in the cell having to be instructed by Lady Philosophy about the value of philosophy and this kind of return to his true homeland. And then the fact that that Boethius, the author who wrote this text, actually must know all this, because otherwise how would he put it in the narrative? But the figure that he creates, that he uses to represent himself as his persona, doesn't know that.
Well, that's very interesting in a lot of senses. One that you have, again, the sort of like dichotomy between, the meaningful life that you took for granted, that was sort of like you had it all, and then the needs, or maybe calling to rediscover it when you are in a moment of crisis. Basically, that again, with job, that becomes a question when you experience that crisis. But also, you also pointed out that, because we talked about briefly about the sort of dichotomy between suffering and happiness when it comes to meaning of life. But also you mentioned now, Carl, and we also mentioned a little bit in between. What does this dichotomy between transience and the eternal play for the meaning of life? What does it matter, or why do people care about whether things are transient or whether they are eternal, whether they are, enjoying the transient things or the eternal things? You mentioned it, Carl. You also mentioned it, Espen, with regards to Augustine. Maybe also commenting on it, Istvan, I don't know. But what do you think about this transience, eternal dichotomy or distinction when it comes to this question of meaning?
Yeah, well, yeah, of course, it's I see this problematized. Well, first, of course, the Ecclesiastes just observes that everything is transient. So that's one of the reasons. there is no meaning, and nothing really makes sense, and that's one observation.
For our listeners, Islam, could you just briefly introduce Ecclesiastes for those who might? The Book of Job is more famous, I think. Yeah, but
yeah. So this is one of the two books in the Hebrew Bible that consist of a series of, let's say, wisdom sayings or short observations, maxims, and such. So there are no stories. It's just a collection of those those aphorisms, maxims. You use the Greek word gnomon, which is a widespread genre in a form of speaking and writing in antiquity. Actually, a lot of wisdom, popular wisdom, especially ethical wisdom, was maintained as maxims, as gnomons, as wise sayings. And so those two books collect such sayings, and it's so one is Proverbs, that's Mishle is the Hebrew title, and the other one is called Ecclesiastes in the English tradition, and that's another book then so both of them contain such sayings, and Ecclesiastes also in the Hebrew Kohelet is known for his, let's assume the writer is a he, his pessimism and the terms like the vanitatum vanitas. So so how you actually translate that, Carl? It's the, well, vanity of vanities. Yeah. Maybe simply. I can't put it any better. So yeah,
nothing new under the sun.
And also including this, there's nothing new under the sun. Yeah, he's a big pessimist, and it's if you read through it, it's just it's in a way, it's a sense, it's very modern. It's in that sense. So yeah, but so yeah, what I say that, so that's more or less isolated. It's probably a later writing, so influenced by Greek philosophy a bit, and this but then the contrast between life, which is all transient, and for that reason maybe not that meaningful after all, versus the kind of eternal. Exactly. That's kind of very typical of Paul, of course, who say, "Oh, I don't care about this life. All I care about is this eternal goal, my not destiny, I wouldn't say that, but my aim, my purpose, my call. I just care that my run a good race and fulfill the call and the task that God and that Christ gave me." And that becomes, of course, that kind of standard becomes really typical. So certainly it's always formulated as concentrating on the important and the eternal versus all this, and this becomes, of course, almost by definition the denial of the worldly, denial of the pleasures, asceticism, as I mentioned, Desert Fathers in some way after that. And it gets very formalized, of course, as a way of life in the monastic tradition. So in the 3rd century, those lonely hermits living in the desert become to I'm making it very simple, but they start to create this cohabiting communities, and then they start to create rules how to run them. It's usually attributed to the name of Pachomius, this Egyptian Coptic military officer who comes up with this idea of organizing this monastic community and life, and then a set of rules, which is exactly about how to keep the focus on the eternal and on the God-given standards. Yes, so this is, of course, a long tradition that then goes into, at least in part, I'm not an expert on that, but ideal of celibacy, which we have seen in Paul already a little bit.
It's interesting on the one hand, because I think that in terms of the idea that there is an eternal that provides continuous meaning for life, maybe that's where where what you said earlier, Espen, where this would come into play, the sort of 20th century break, where there seems to be nothing eternal beyond the transient. It seems to be just the transient, is what many people would say today. Then, of course, the one caveat to that in regards to Nietzsche is his idea of the eternal recurrence of the same. He has this idea, but it's very complicated. The easy version would be to say that he asks, let's say that everything that has ever happened were to occur the same way that it has occurred in our life, and would do so eternally, that everything would eternally recur as the same. Would you be able to affirm that, or would it disgust you? And if you're able to affirm that, then you have sort of met Nietzsche's test. But then some people speculate that it's not just this sort of hypothetical thought experiment that Nietzsche is discussing. He actually does have some theory that the universe eternally recurs as the same. And then it becomes more metaphysical, which would be kind of paradoxical for Nietzsche. But I guess but nevertheless, bringing Nietzsche into the slot would put this sort of in terms of our modern world. Does it make sense, or what do any of you, for example, think that there is something eternal that you are orienting your lives in regards to, in contrast to the transient? Does this dichotomy make sense for us today?
I don't know if I want to answer this, but I try anyway. I mean, it's a very must say that I haven't given it so much a thought, because there's something about transient, eternal. There's something especially about the concept of eternity that seems to be stuck in my mind in some kind of metaphysical scheme that I'm not sure if I could wholeheartedly affirm, namely that you have, what should it be, as an endless duration or a standstill, or but then we always think in terms of time, but it has to be probably thought of as something just transcendent. So what I do find, I mean, if we're trying to attach this to the question of meaning of life, I guess one of the things one can say quite general about, taking a religious point of view, is that it decenters you. It gives a radical perspective from the outside on your life. So if you, let's say, we don't have to be very pious or believers or anything, but the just imagine seeing your life from a quite different, a radical different perspective. Let's call it eternity for now, subspecia or aeternis. That the kind of, that there's something about that kind of perspective that in itself might make a difference to how you conceive your finite, limited life on earth. Might also be a challenging, that kind of perspective on yourself, whether you live according to the standard that you really, whether divine or not, what that you really want to pursue in your life, and so on. So I don't know, that's a very meager notion of eternity, but at least to keep up this thought about that there is a perspective from which all the things that seems to be important to you at the moment, well, they are quite small in a grander perspective. I think that's something that, people in general would, should take into consideration from time to time, at least.